A few years ago, my wife came to me with an unusual request. She needed me to build a tray to put some decor items on top of, wait for it, a toilet tank. Yes, we had just renovated our powder room in our old home, and she needed me to make it a little bit more special and put some stuff on top of there. So she sent me some ideas from Pinterest and some other websites, and I thought they were fine, but not fine enough. That's when I, ironically sitting on said toilet, came across one of the most beautiful trays I had ever seen. Haida Martin had just written an article on Fine Woodworking magazine describing her tray design, which had all of the elements that I've been wanting to try plus a few more. And I thought to myself, that's definitely fine enough. And that was the beginning of my woodworking journey. I didn't have a nice shop like I have today, or even the experience to think that I could pull a fine woodworking piece off. But that was the kind of challenge that really drove me in the beginning, and it still drives me to this day. So I got really excited and I got to work.
For this project, I decided to use what I had laying around for walnut. I knew that if I did a good job with selecting the grain, things would look as fine woodworky as I wanted. Milling has always been something I enjoy doing. For me, it's one of those magical moments in woodworking when you're the first person in the whole world to see what this tree had hiding for decades, maybe even centuries. That's also a big responsibility because if you mess it up, you're letting nature down. You're wasting beauty, if that makes sense. You're gonna hear me get excited about a lot of things in this video, but that's usually when I've done something I wasn't too confident to begin with. Resawing is something I do quite a bit today, but you're witnessing one of my first successful attempts. I needed the board at the bottom of the tray to be 1/4 of an inch thick, and following some advice I'd learned from Alex Snodgrass on how to set up the bandsaw, as well as proper resawing technique, I think it came out super well and I was really happy. Even though I did have a jointer, I ended up using a tapering jig on my table saw to create a straight edge on all my pieces. I was struggling a little bit to set up my jointer for edge joining, and once I had a straight edge, I ripped the other side to its final width. Then it was time to finalize the milling of all my pieces by cross-cutting them to their final length on my crosscut sled. I think if you ask all woodworkers you know what they think makes a piece be fine woodworking, you'll probably get a lot of different answers, but from my own listening to many I respect and my own observations, there's a lot of attention being put into grain selection, consistency of reviews, edge profiling, finish, but I think most will say that joinery is a big piece of it, and that was the part that I was getting into. This was one of the defining parts in this piece. Joinery looks really cool and it was a really clever design, so I felt some pressure to get it right. So I took a good amount of time to make a bunch of test cuts and scrap pieces of plywood to dial in my setup. What you see me doing is cutting the bottom notches on the side pieces that will house the breadboard ends. After a lot of tapping and fine tuning, I tested the cut plywood with the real breadboard end, and once I was happy with the fit, I added a backer piece made of scrap plywood to avoid blowout and started cutting into my sides using a dado set. Thankfully, everything was fitting well on the real side, so I proceeded with cutting all of the other pieces using the same setup. The handles for this tray were 3/8 of an inch from the top and 5/16 narrower than the breadboard end, so I used this spacer between the blade and the jig fence and lowered the blade. And same process as the breadboard ends. I tested with the plywood piece, and after I was happy with that, I cut the handle notches into the sides using a plywood backer. If there was a process I wasn't too excited about, it was definitely cutting the rabbets on the tray bottoms. At that time, I decided to use a rabbiting bit on my router table, and that was one of the decisions I would probably have made differently today. and I'll show you why in a moment. The bottom board was a 1/4 inch thick, so I needed to raise the bit to cut exactly half of that thickness and 3/8 of an inch deep. The first part of that cut was fine, since the bearing had a constant edge to ride. The next step was to cut a rabbet on the flip side of the bottom, and that's where the decision to use a rabbeting bit actually bit me. For this, I really should have used a dado tat on my table saw, since the bearing did not have a proper edge to ride on at the beginning and at the end of that cut. So what ended up happening is the bit went a little deeper than the 3/8 of an inch, which created a little gap that I had to address later on. But life continued, and since I was already at the router table, I used a 1/8 inch straight bits to cut the slots for the bottoms. You can use a flat bottom table saw blade for this as well. The slots needed to be 3/8 of an inch deep, even though the sides would only go in about 3/16 of an inch, but that extra depth combined with the depth of the rabbet at the bottom piece, which was also 3/8 of an inch deep, would allow for the bottom to move freely with the seasons. I think it was such a clever design, and I wish everyone would flip the tray over and appreciate that detail, but I know only woodworkers care. By the way, you probably already noticed this, but I'm making 2 of these. One for us, and we decided to give one as a gift. Then it was time to cut a slot for the bottom on the breadboard ends. Here I used a 1/8 inch straight cut bit as well, and in this case I do think it was the best tool for the job. I just added a couple of stop locks on the router table fence to indicate the beginning and the end of the cuts, and I set the width of the slots to be about 1/4 of an inch off either side of the breadboard end, and that would allow enough space for the bottom to move freely. I think as long as you don't cut through the piece, you should be fine. Another super cool design detail on this was that the sides were tapered on the inside. In the original Fine Woodworking article, Heidi used a slat for the thickness planer, but I decided to use the table saw. Since I had designed the tray on SketchUp, I just took the angle from the file and cut the tapers on all sides. Then it was time for glue up. This can be a tricky one, so I decided to tackle that in 2 stages. In the first stage, I glued up the bottom to the breadboard ends. You really only need a little bit of glue on the center to pin it in place and allow for the rest of the width to move freely with the seasons. I ended up using the side of the tray as a guide to ensure that not only the breadboard ends were centered with the bottom, which is by the way helped with these handy shim spacers on both sides, but also because it ensured that the bottom didn't flex too much when I applied clamping pressure. Once that stage was dry, I taped the ends of the breadboard ends to prepare it for sanding, since that was going to be glued up to the sides later on. A little recommendation, just don't go too crazy on the sanding here, because that can definitely mess up with the thickness of the bottom and make things not fit well when gluing the rest of it up. And since I was at it, I pre-sanded the rest of the pieces as well, and I did use a sander, and even though it worked well, you really have to be careful not to mess up with the clean angles and joinery. It's not totally out of the question to actually hand sand it with a hardwood sanding block, or even hand planing it in some cases if you feel up for the challenge. And once that was done, I proceeded to the second stage of the glue up, which was to add the glue to the notches on the sides and assemble the bottom and the handles. Again, I used 1/8 of an inch handy shims to ensure proper spacing between the rabbet edges and the internal walls of the sides. Then I used a couple of parallel clamps to ensure the shims wouldn't fall off from the bottom. And added F-style clamps to finalize the glue up on both ends, making sure to use some scrap pieces of plywood as cauls to equalize clamping pressure. The sides will likely break if you don't use them, After the glue was dry, I took them off clamps and did a final sanding. And now it was time for the finishing touches, which frankly elevate this piece to the next level. First, I made two 1/8 inch stopped holes on each side on my drill press, which will accommodate the brass pins. I cut the pins with a hacksaw and glued them up with the 5-minute epoxy. To remove the excess epoxy and flush trim the pins, I sent the trace through my drum sander, which I do realize it was a luxury. You can definitely just sand it by hand here. I used that wipe-on oil base poly as a finish and started to see how beautiful the grain was. Honestly, here you can use whatever you want. Nowadays, I've been gravitating more towards hard wax oils for pieces like this, mostly because of the really good results without the nasty smell and VOCs. The final finishing touch was the addition of a 2mm diameter black waxed cord. This was a basic lashing technique that's often used on the handles of knives and axes. I started and ended the lashing under the handle where it will be hidden. With the help of a tape, I secured one end of the loop and wrapped a length of cord around the handle and finalized the other side by pushing the end of the cord under the loop and pulling both ends with a plier to hide them. And then the tray was done. I cannot be happier with how it turned out. I know it's a tray and it will live on top of my toilet tank, but look at it, it's so beautiful. The combination of the walnut with the details of brass and the black cord, as well as all of the visible joinery, tapered sides, the floating bottom. I love this tray and I love what it represented in that stage in my journey. Pushing myself to experience new techniques and even, dare I say, build a fine woodworking piece. Thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next one.